There was lots of talks about this big offensive by the Russians. It hasn't led to anything very much. It's largely petered out. Everyone's still focused on Bakhmut. If that's the sum total of what the Russians can offer, then they haven't got much in the locker. I mean, this battle has been going on for about 6 months now, and as you say, it's a relatively small town. It's not of great strategic significance, and yet it's become symbolic. It's been a brutal fight between the Russians and the Ukrainians. And its significance to the Ukrainians is that it's fixing very large amounts of Russian forces, particularly from the Wagner Group, in that one small battle. Huge amounts of ammunition being thrown at it by the Russians. We've heard all the stories of the Wagner Group using prisoners, just throwing people into, I think they described it as a meat grinder. So the Russians want the victory because it'll give them a little morale boost, and they'll probably make great play of it if they secure the town. But the Ukrainians are really the winners in this. They'll have paid a significant price themselves, but they've really fixed the Russians there for about 6 months.
So it's fascinating listening to that, Rupert. And listening to that, my impression is the Russians are fighting rather like mugs. They're throwing valuable men. They're throwing men. I know we know they don't care too much about losing their men in battle, but they're throwing them in huge numbers. There's no great importance to this place. You look at an aerial picture, and you just see a wasted, destroyed town, and the number of civilians in that place now are just a few thousand. The Ukrainians seem to be achieving what they want on your analysis. I've been reading that maybe the losses are 7-1 in Ukraine's favour. So what on earth are the Russians thinking? Is this just an obsession with symbols?
Well, I mean, they are rather fighting like mugs. Of course, once they get themselves into that Bakhmut fight, they can't back off. They can't ease away. There'll be another defeat. So they've got to kind of try and grind it out. But they've demonstrated over the last year, we've commented on this all the way through, they've lacked the kind of military nuance and what we call the operational art to really design the campaign. So they go into this kind of meat grind, as the Ukrainians call it, at Bakhmut, and they just try and plug their way through. And, talk of, trench systems reminiscent of the First World War are relevant here.
Yes. And as for the state of the war, again, I mean, I think we knew this, but I'm seeing over the weekend analysis that suggests that Russia, for all of the fighting, for all of the losses, they're taking very little ground.
Yeah, absolutely. So, since those big gains by the Ukrainians in the kind of back end of the autumn last year, the front line has really stabilized, and people call it kind of positional warfare, where no one side is really taking the advantage. There was lots of talks about this big offensive by the Russians. It hasn't led to anything very much. It's largely petered out. Everyone's still focused on Bakhmut. If that's the sum total of what the Russians can offer, then they haven't got much in the locker. The question will be, when will the Ukrainians feel able to go on the counter-offensive themselves? What will that look like, and where will it come?
And well, at this rate, then, Russians taking very little ground, losing personnel heavily, certainly by proportion with Ukraine's losses. They're going to be on the back foot, one imagines, or at least I, as a layman, imagine, before too very long. And I wonder where that plays out, because are we looking at Putin recognizing that the war is going nowhere, or are we looking at this sort of thing, this bloody stalemate over minute amounts of territory just going on and on?
Well, I mean, I think the chances of Putin recognizing that the war's not going very well, at least publicly, is essentially zero.
Sure.
So the question is what actually happens on the ground. And, it can't stay in this kind of fixed position forever. It's really in the Ukrainians' interest to get on the front foot, get moving forward again, as soon as they feel they've got the combat power, not least from the Western materiel, to achieve another breakthrough.
All right, can I just ask your thoughts on closer to home on British defence strategy and our fitness as a military power? Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, we read now is going to get £5 billion out of the Treasury, not 11 billion over 2 years. How much of a setback? Because I take it for granted you see that as a setback. How serious is that?
I see that as a huge setback. I really do. the UK defence has been hollowed out. It really has. No, none of your listeners should underestimate how much it has been hollowed out. Our service personnel, our troops, our sailors, our airmen still do an extraordinary job, but they're not being resourced in the way they need to be. And, you know, with the greatest respect to Ben Wallace, he's been Defence Secretary for 3.5 years. If he can't make the case in the current climate for an uplift in defence spending, then I think there's some pretty fundamental questions, because the British population, for the first time in a very long time, recognises a war on their doorstep. Indeed, you know, the Times poll, the last time I checked, 92% of the readers said there should be an increase in defence spending. So we really shouldn't underestimate how big the problem is facing UK defence, and what a massive failure it will be if the answer is only 4 or 5 billion.
Now, let me just squeeze this last question in, because the Times is reporting now, Rupert, that the Britain is looking at buying a fleet, if a fleet is the right corrective noun, of spy balloons capable of flying at this high altitude over hostile states. What do you think of that?
I just wish I can't speak to the veracity of that report.
It's in the Times, so you can take it as read. It's true.
Yes, I think you know it worries me because it feels like a knee-jerk response. If we needed spy balloons in the arsenal, then they should have been a capability requirement over a considerable period of time. I'm sure people know what they're doing, but I find it slightly quizzical.